Welcome to the Respectful Divorce Podcast. If you're considering a divorce, it's important to know that you have options for how you divorce. On the Respectful Divorce Podcast, we explore those options and provide advice from divorce professionals. We're joined today on the Respectful Divorce Podcast by Carrie Williams with Rain Shadow Coaching. And Carrie, we appreciate your being with us. We're at the Collaborative Conference in Tacoma, Washington today, where you were a featured speaker. What'd you talk about?
I got to talk about a tool that I created called the Spectrum of Willingness. And it's a tool that can be used in collaborative law. Yeah. I use it as an executive and leadership coach in the work that I do in team coaching. It can be used in sales, but it's really a tool that helps you identify where a person is on the spectrum of willingness and readiness. So you can meet them where they're at and have negotiations and conversations and move the entire process forward. But if you don't acknowledge where people are starting from and you just push, the whole process crumbles.
So just willingness to go through the process. What when you say willingness?
When I say willingness, I mean willingness to do the work, to show up open and honest, sometimes vulnerable, and willing to own what is yours to own in that conversation. So you show up without contingency, not I'll have this conversation if you're willing to negotiate here, or I'll sit at the table if you're going to feed me this. It's really, I choose to sit at the table and see what outcome we can create together. So that's what I mean when I talk about willingness. If we're looking at it in terms of a team, it's how willing are you to do everything that is yours to own in terms of your role and in terms of supporting the team, regardless of how the rest of the team shows up.
So how do you know when someone is willing or not willing?
You have to listen to them. So people will tell you where they are on that spectrum, and they'll tell you with their words and they'll tell you with their body language. So if they're saying things like, I really don't want to be here, I'm not, in terms of divorce proceedings, I'm not ready for a divorce, or I'm only here because he's forcing me to be, or here's a good one, this is a waste of time and money. If you hear those, they're on the lower end of the spectrum. They might be unwilling or resentful willing or reluctant willing. If they're that low, two things to know. One, the best you're going to get from them is minimum compliance. They're never going to be a fully invested collaborative partner. You might be able to drag them along through the process, but they're never going to make the process easier. They're never going to be proactive in the process. And two, if you're at that lower end of the spectrum, your cortisol is really high. And we know that when people are making decisions or building relationships, if your cortisol is high, your regulation is off. So you're going to be more emotional, you're going to be more impatient, possibly more short, more rash in your decision making. So it's really hard to get people calm enough to have a collaborative conversation if they're flooded with cortisol.
So then how do you get them to that willing point? What is it from a coaching standpoint that and whether that is coaching as the divorce coach or coaching as the attorney, how do you move them to that level of willingness?
Here's the super tricky part. You can't. You can invite them to join you up the spectrum. You can use this tool as education so that they become more reflective and identify where they are in the spectrum and how where they're showing up is impacting the entire process. And then you can invite them to move up. You can also shift your language and your approach based on where they are. But I can't change where you are in the spectrum. Where you are in the spectrum is completely your choice.
So then for that person, what changes with them when they are able to become more willing? Or do you have to go through the process with someone kicking and screaming along the way?
Ideally, no. And I think a lot of the cases that get stalled or take longer than they should are because we have people on different levels of willingness. Maybe one is ready for this divorce and ready for the negotiation and ready for the conversations, and someone else isn't. But what's interesting about collaborative cases is you're not just dealing with the willingness of the clients. You're dealing with the willingness of all the collaborative professionals, and everybody's going to be at a different stage of the spectrum. And so if you've got somebody who's all in committed willing, which is the top of the spectrum, enthusiastic willing, and somebody who's reluctant willing, they're going to show up very differently. But what happens if you've got someone, say one professional is hopeful willing and one is enthusiastic willing, and you have a client who is eager willing and a client who's resentful willing, what tends to happen is the person higher up the spectrum starts pushing everyone else, and they'll push them into false agreements. And when someone on the lower end of the spectrum gets pushed into a false agreement, that's when they dig in and they get more resistant. So if you're a collaborative professional and you've had conversations where you leave a meeting thinking you have agreement and you've moved forward, and then you start the next meeting and somebody backtracks and says, no, that wasn't right, it's because somebody higher up the spectrum pushed everyone instead of meeting them where they are and having the conversation they needed to have to move up the spectrum, so then the agreement would actually stand.
Now, you're not actually a collaborative coach. That's not what you do, right?
No.
So what do you do?
I do executive and leadership and team coaching. So I've been a credentialed coach for over 15 years now. And for those of you who are familiar with non-collaborative coaching, I am an International Coach Federation credential coach. I'm at the MCC level, which is a master credential coach. It's the highest credential there is. There's about 2,500 of us in the world last time I looked. And then I'm also an ACTC, which is our accredited team coaching. So with those two credentials, last I looked, and it's been a few months, so don't quote me on this, there were 35 of us in the country. So I'm fully committed, willing to coaching.
So how and why did you get involved in this area?
Well, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, as you can probably tell by the name of my company, Rain Shadow Coaching. I was born in a rain shadow out on the peninsula, and I was raised in Alaska. So in my heart, even though I live in California and that's where my business is, I'm a Pacific Northwest girl at heart. And I was invited to this the very first time by a client who connected me with somebody on their board, and they had me come and speak. And this is actually my 6th or 7th year coming up here and speaking to this group. They keep inviting me back, which is amazing and incredibly flattering. And I will always come back if they ask me. But I love speaking to this group in particular, and collaborative professionals in general, because they come with such an energy to be a part of the conversation and to learn. And they show up to a workshop like they would show up to a client call with eagerness. They're looking for ways to make it better. They're looking for ways to make it work. And so I always like to come and bring a new idea and not workshop it with them because it's always fully formed, but they always make it better. So the people I speak to after I speak here, they're always grateful because I tweak it afterwards.
Carrie Williams with Rain Shadow Coaching. Carrie, thanks for joining us on the Respectful Divorce podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.